Well, welcome, everyone. Forgive my broken tooth. I haven't been in a fight. I just foolishly chipped it while I was doing some wiring work. Well, we have a great pleasure and privilege of having with us today Andrew Gould, who will be known to many of you as, I would say, the foremost Orthodox Church architect in the West, but as we see also someone who is fantastic doing domestic architecture as well. Especially known, I think, in his architecture for, on the one hand, being true to timeless principles, but on the other hand, rooting his designs in place. So if you look at his website, New World Byzantine, you'll see he studies not only the indigenous style, as it were, to that particular town or area, but also draws on the local materials wherever possible. So this is someone very close to my heart. You may know him also through his writings in the Orthodox Arts Journal, which he founded. So I do encourage you to read those articles there. A bit of his background, Andrew lives in, I think, probably the most beautiful, is it a town or city, Andrew?
A city.
A city, yes, in the USA. He lives there and he has a degree in art history and also a degree in architecture. In 2011, he also founded New World Byzantine Studios, and he makes church furnishings, lighting, etc., all beautifully crafted. So welcome, Andrew. I thought we would discuss today the basilican design of church. The main reason for this is that, though probably most Orthodox would agree, the ideal church design is a domed, centrally oriented church, basically a square floor plan for the nave and a dome and apse, etc. In reality, at least for us in Britain and in Europe, most Orthodox churches have got to use an existing church which is effectively basilican in design. By basilica, I mean, though technically I suppose it means a rectangular church with at least one aisle either side, it could be two either side, and an apse. But I'm using it in the more generic sense here as a rectangular church without a dome. So I wanted to talk about this partially for selfish reasons. Our parish church is outgrowing our lovely 13th century church, and we're going to start using for our Sunday liturgy a basilica, basically, which has been given to us. So my thoughts have been the best way of adapting this church. So I thought we'd start, Andrew, with you telling us what do you think the strengths and the weaknesses, or the strengths and limitations are, first of the basilican design and then of the domed, centrally oriented church, because I think we both agree you don't want to force onto basilica something that was really intended iconographically or whatever for a dome church, and vice versa.
Exactly. Well, I think the first thing to consider is that a basilica has more singularity of focus. The visual focus of a basilica is very much forward to the altar, and secondarily upward, depending on the architecture. If you're talking about a Gothic cathedral, for instance, the upward axis is pretty intense also. But that tends to be only in the grandest and most Gothic of basilicas. Your average parish church, for instance, tends not to have that much verticality. It's a much more forward focus, and of course the ancient basilicas, the early Christian or Romanesque basilicas, are very much a forward focus, and this is in contrast to a domed Byzantine church where the focus is much more all around, left, right, up, down, forward, back, and sort of circularly following the fresco cycles around the walls. All of these axes kind of have equal emphasis in that sort of a church. Secondarily, a strength of the basilica is that it tends to emphasize architecture more, whereas the domed Byzantine church tends to emphasize the painting, the murals, more. The Byzantine church, over its history, tended to have less and less architecture and more just plain plastered surfaces, in order to receive murals. So we see a progression where, starting out with Hagia Sophia in the 6th century, there's beautiful marble columns and beautiful capitals and marble revetment and quite a lot of interest to the building that's purely architecture. And then the vaults originally did not even have any iconography on them. They were just gold and blue mosaics with stars. But then over the next 1,000 years, Byzantine architecture had less and less marble paneling, less and less, architectural sculpture, and more plaster and murals. And those murals had less and less sort of decorative elements, like stars and trees and landscape, and more icons of saints, until you get to a late medieval monastic church. There's essentially nothing but plaster, and the plaster is painted with nothing but saints. And again, the focus becomes completely all around. So is
So
this
with
a
that in
strength?
mind, how would you, given the directional nature of the basilica, assuming that it's not a Gothic type one, you've got this basically west-east orientation. Historically, what are the main iconographic forms? First of all, we've got 3 areas, haven't we, really? The apse itself, the triumphal arch, the arch that leads into the apse, and then the north and south walls. So perhaps you could tell our listeners common themes given this east-west axis.
You mean iconographic themes?
Iconographically, yeah. Given that there is this directional feeling to it that's horizontal rather than vertical.
Yeah, well, in a basilica of the first millennium, where it has essentially a Byzantine mode of iconography in it, it's typically the apse will have the principal icon, and it'll usually be either Christ or the Mother of God, and additional surrounding figures that are often fairly locally specific to the dedication of the church. And oftentimes that was the only iconography. There's, quite a lot of the basilicas in Italy, have a splendid icon in the apse. They might have another one on the west wall, and that's often seems to be as far as they took it. The side walls had marble revetment. When you do see iconography on the side walls, well, sometimes there's a procession of saints like you see in Ravenna. Sometimes it's just a series of festal compositions, like at Santa Maria Maggiore. But of course, a basilica is not conducive to the same complexity of iconography as a cruciform and domed church, because there's simply not as many surfaces that are mirroring and relating to one another in different directions, and there's not as much height for hierarchical tiers, and there's not any vertical termination to the building. Of course, all of the central iconography in a domed church is a hierarchy going up to Christ Pantocrator at the top in the dome, and there's no vertical hierarchy like that in a basilica. So the iconographic scheme is by necessity going to be on the sort of simple and straightforward side, which is not a bad thing in a modern Orthodox church. I think one of the reasons that iconography became so complex and even esoteric in late Byzantine architecture is because it was primarily monastic churches that were being painted, and monks, of course, are in church all the time, and monks spend their life studying theology. So monks like to have a lot of complexity, so that everywhere you sit in the church, you're seeing something new. You can meditate upon the icons and kind of understand new theological relationships. Every day, the homilist can think of some new thing to point out in the iconographic relationships to tie into the readings of the day. They need that complexity for their way of life. I don't think parish churches require that. I think in some ways it's actually a virtue for parish churches to have relatively straightforward iconography where a Protestant or a newly converted person, someone without a degree in theology, can come into the church and say, "Oh, I understand. There's Christ up at the front. It is him who you worship. This makes sense to me." So that I think can actually be a strength of a basilica.
I agree in principle. I think there are some exceptions in Rome. So if we look at Santa Prassede, which has got a really complex iconography, though essentially on the theme of Christ's second coming and the New Jerusalem. It's interesting that most of the mosaic churches in Rome, I would say up to the 10th century, have these brightly colored clouds in the background. So initially it seems just to be Christ present with you now, which it is, but also these brightly colored clouds suggest that you're also seeing Christ coming out of the future. It's the second coming. Christ is rising like the sun. So you've got that, and as you say, the local saints, the patron saint. But then often in the triumphal arch, you have quite complex images with the New Jerusalem, the jeweled walls, the 24 elders, the 7 candlestands, etc., etc. But in those more complex cases, I think they're just trying to put as much as possible because that's the only space they've got.
That's right.
Whereas, as you say, with the Byzantine church, you can spread it out. You have every single surface that's designed for a wall painting. Yeah. Okay. So, how would you describe the essential principles that a parish priest or committee ought to have in mind when they're given, let's just say, a blank basilican church? They don't have to take anything out, but it's just a blank church, nicely designed. And they've got to try to adapt it to Orthodox liturgy. What would your advice be? Just to say, they want to paint the walls. No, I don't mean figurative painting initially. They've only got enough money just to paint the columns and the walls or put something on the floor. They're very basic. What atmosphere do you think, if it's a parish church rather than monastery, would one want to create, both with the lighting and the ethos created with the wall colors and the ceiling colors? What would be the spiritual principle, would you say?
Well, some very practical advice. You always want the church to feel warm, not cold. The worst thing you can do is to paint the inside of a church blue. And Orthodox churches do this all the time. They have the notion that because frescoes often have a blue background, that you should go into a church and paint everything blue. And that, of course, makes for a dark, gloomy, depressing space. It makes for a space that sucks up candlelight, like the light doesn't even exist, because candles, of course, give off orange light, which means that blue walls will not reflect that light at all. It'll absorb 100% of it. So never do that. Never paint a church blue. Paint a church a warm tone. If the church doesn't have much architectural beauty, then you're probably going to want to paint it kind of a light yellow ochre color, and just infuse it with warmth, using your paint color. Now, if the church has a lot of wood, if it's got timber ceilings and beautiful wood furniture, then painting it an off-white, like sort of an ivory tone, is often a very handsome contrast, because you already have the warm orangey color in all of the woodwork. And that's, of course, the normative color scheme in an English parish church is off-white plaster and then lots and lots of beautiful woodwork. And that's a very good atmosphere for a church. In terms of the lighting, you want the space to feel like it is glowing from within, which means your lighting should be coming from chandeliers principally, as well as candelabra and lampadas and so forth. But the light source should be internal to the space. It should not be a modern spotlighting system where you have concealed lighting shining on the walls or on the floor, because that gives you the impression that the surfaces are bright, but that the space is dark. And that has its purposes in secular applications, but when you're talking about developing a liturgical aesthetic, spotlighting is absolutely counterproductive to achieving that sense that there's a warm emanation of uncreated light within the space, that the sort of sense of God is with us. The people in the space are glowing just like the saints and the icons glow with their halos. The light has to be down in front of the iconostasis. A low hanging chandelier is ideal. Um, Ideally, the iconostasis has gilded icons, and the chandelier hangs just a bit in front of the iconostasis and not too high off the ground. And that way, the light from the chandelier will reflect off of the gilded icons and back down at the people at that correct angle of reflection, so that the iconostasis will feel very bright from the perspective of the congregation. Um, that's quite important. Another big mistake is spotlights behind the iconostasis lighting up the back wall, because then the iconostasis appears to be dark and backlit, which is what makes it seem like a obstacle blocking your view, and that is often the origin of these pastoral issues where people want transparent iconostases because they don't want anything blocking your view. No, that's an error, because the iconostasis is your view. So the iconostasis needs to be brightly lit from the front, and the altar space behind needs to be dimly lit for the symbolism to work right.
When I was doing an article on liturgical lighting, it struck me, just thinking of my own experience at my hermitage and Mount Athos, because you have very low ambient light, the services are at night and you haven't got electrical lighting. The lighting tends to concentrate around where the faces of the saints are. So when you enter the church, you don't really notice the architecture first. You notice the faces of the saints, because the oil lamps are near the faces of the saints.
That's right.
And then you become aware of the architecture. And the other thing you mentioned about the light should fill the space itself in a way, rather than the walls, should be the emphasis. This struck me reading a book by Basilica Pancheva, where she was saying that after the fall of iconoclasm, which is on the cusp of it being defeated, toward the end of St John of Damascus's writing, and particularly later St Theodore, instead of using the word icon so much, they started using the word typos, which means an impression. So you have a foot which then presses into the sand and leaves a negative imprint. So I thought about this as icon, not just as a painted icon, but the church temple is an icon. There, the space becomes the icon. Yeah, you've got the church building, but in fact, it's the space that creates, the negative space, which then cries out to be filled with the prototype, which is the Holy Spirit. So I think it's something that people forget, that a cup or a building only has usefulness as long as it's empty inside. In other words, it's got a space inside. A cup that's solid ceramic is useless. You can't,
and I
hold anything.
And I think that concept of space is clear in Byzantine architecture, that again the architecture seems to be conceived basically as just a shell for plastered surfaces to be painted upon. And the outside of the building often seems somewhat arbitrary in Byzantine architecture. So it's pretty clear that mindset was that you're creating a space in which to perceive the kingdom of heaven is the purpose of the building. In Western architecture, you have more of a sense that the building is the point, that the building is a spectacularly ornate and orderly temple of beauty. It doesn't conceal its materiality. When you look at an English church, it's all stone and timber, and the earthiness of its materials is very forward, and it even has a sort of a naturalistic look to it, that the tracery and the vaulting, it looks tree-like, nature-like. It's all carved with little birds and animals. So an English church very much feels like sort of the stuff of earth lifted up towards heaven and made a sort of taking all the chaos of nature and ordering it according to sacred geometry as an offering to God. That's kind of the feeling you get, particularly with a Gothic church.
Columns almost like trees, aren't they? Especially the
Yes,
fan vaults.
yes. Yeah, you don't get as much sense that it's an icon of heaven, that you're supposed to sort of look past the building the way you feel in a Byzantine church. In a Byzantine church, you kind of get a sense that it's an illusion where you're supposed to kind of lose any lose any sense that the building is actually made of anything physical, and you're just seeing the saints and the glow. Um, but in English church, it's materiality. It's, you
Mm,
know,
mm,
stone and lead and timber and tile. They're always very much at the forefront of your conscience.
mm.
I think that's a beautiful thing. As a craftsman, I love that craftsmanly materiality of English churches, and I don't think that should be undermined, but it is somewhat outside of the direction that Byzantine architecture developed, and it's important to be
No,
cognizant of that.
I do think that one's got to keep in mind that we had an iconoclasm here, that my parish church, for example, when we inherited it, it was whitewashed,
Yeah,
but underneath were wall paintings. And it wasn't a particularly wealthy church, but they still felt compelled to paint every single wall that there was there. Most of it was a simple scroll design, but we did discover a depiction of the martyrdom of Thomas Becket. So I think what we see now is in how a lot of these churches were originally, they would have been frescoed. You see remnants more in Spain and France, which didn't have the same degree of iconoclasm we had under Henry
yeah.
VIII and Cromwell. But yeah, certainly it's more sort of earthy. Yeah, the substance of the shell is given great emphasis, whereas as you said, I agree entirely. The Orthodox dome church is Byzantine dome church. It exists to disappear in a way. It exists to turn into the heavenly Jerusalem,
Yes.
to be a ground to depict the saints.
I've made several trips to Eastern Europe lately on architecture tours, and it's really struck me that when you go as a tourist to visit churches in Eastern Europe, like meaning in Orthodox countries like Serbia, Macedonia, Georgia, um, you're mainly going to look at frescoes. You're not going to look at architecture.
Mm.
Architecturally, you know, one building often looks almost indistinguishable from the next, and you go from one monastery to another mainly because there's some very important fresco you want to see at the next church. Um, in contrast to when you're visiting churches in Western Europe, you're mostly going to see architecture, you know, really spectacular piles of stone and sculpted stone and so forth.
Mm.
Um, and it's interesting to recognize that difference in cultural focus, that it's undoubtedly the case that architecture developed far more, you know, refinement, sculptural complexity, and just grandeur in the
Mm.
West,
Mm.
whereas though the churches in Eastern Europe are comparatively humble, the paintings are quite frankly better. You know, you'll go quite far out of your way in Eastern Europe to see, you know, one little fragmentary remnant of a Byzantine fresco because, you know, you look at that and you truly feel like you're gazing on the face of God when you see it. It's an incredible encounter, and it experiences with paintings like that are few and far between in Western Europe. You know, they have beautiful paintings in the West, but they are not engaging with that kind of spiritual intensity, with rare exceptions.
Interesting that during the Seventh Ecumenical Council, as you know, the Acts were rather badly translated to Latin. And the defense of images in the West was basically that they're good teaching tools. So why there is this concentration on imagery just as a teaching tool, whereas in the East, it's much more a place of encounter. It's a portal, it's a place of encounter, a holy place where you encounter the fellowship of the saints. And why that should have been so, I suppose the Latin language, the Latin people were more probably legally minded. They liked order. The Romans were very good at ordering and administration. The Easterners, the Greek mind was much more speculative, more philosophical. I think there's a lot behind this slightly different emphasis, actually not too slightly, it's quite a big difference of emphasis on the function of image. Um, yeah, Abbot Sugar's interesting, why he built basically what's the first Gothic cathedral. his emphasis on light and jewels. He was basically creating the New Jerusalem, his delight and shiny, colourful things, was all inspired by the architecture itself, trying to be the New Jerusalem. So not so much interest in figurative work, though that was emphasized more on the little objects that he commissioned, rather than as we would have in the wall paintings or the mosaics.
Yeah, well, consider that the primary icon in the Western Church is the crucifix, whereas the primary icon in the Eastern Church is the painting of Christ Pantocrator. Western Church piety is so extremely focused on the image of Christ on the cross. Whether it's an English church with the great rood is the primary focus of the people, and then the altar cross is the primary focus of the priest. So this is the image of Christ crucified. It's an image of a historical moment. The Western Church's piety is focused on looking back to that moment when Christ died for our sins. Whereas the Eastern Church, in choosing to make the primary image that we engage with Christ Pantocrator, which is a sort of an eternal image, an image that doesn't have any particular moment of time associated with it, but is how we understand Christ to be now, Christ reigning as King of the universe, as it were. The Eastern Church piety has this sense of God being present with us. When we pray, we understand God to be right here now. Now is what matters. And we don't actually have a whole lot of cognizance of the crucifixion represented in the Eastern prayers. We don't even have that much cognizance of Christ as mediator. In the Western Church, every prayer ends with through Jesus Christ our Lord. So every single prayer is cognizant of the mediation of Christ through his death on the cross, reconciling us to God. Pray to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. The cross is present in every prayer. Again, in the Eastern Church, we tend to just pray to God, and we understand God to be present. He's with us now within the temple. There he is, reigning as Pantocrator right there in front of us. So I think every detail of the prayers and piety of the Eastern Church has that difference of an immediate experience of the presence of God or the saints. And every aspect of the piety of the Western Church has that sense of a certain remove and a certain reference back to the historical life of Christ on earth thousands of years ago. I think that tells us quite a lot about that difference of how the iconography and the focus developed in the two churches.
That's the challenge I'm having with this current church, St Julian's, which hopefully we will be given. In fact, it's owned privately now. So I have the privilege of having a lot of time worshipping in the church, thinking about future adjustments to the architecture, not the original architecture, but a lot have been added to it in the last 50 years, but also primarily wall painting. And I think it would suit very well wall paintings on the north and south walls, as well as the apse, or certainly start in the apse and the triumphal arch. Because I think it is important to create the sense of our earthly worship being a participation in heavenly worship, of the saints being present with us, of Christ being present with us, and having standing saints on the side looking out on us will really help gain the sense that we're, when we start a service, not actually starting the service, we're joining in the ceaseless worship of heaven. So on the one hand, I don't want the iconography to force anything onto it it's not made for, but certainly the spaces between the windows, and the windows are fortunately rounded ones, they're not pointed ones, so that would immediately gives the sense of an incarnational feel. So I think in this case, without doing any violence to the architecture, and I'll show you pictures of it for our viewers, you've seen them already, the space. But I think that the tensions, aren't there? You want to try to create that Orthodox atmosphere you're speaking of Christ present with us, but on the other hand, not do violence to the architecture you've got, which may have been created with a slightly different emphasis in mind. Are there any
Yes.
principles you could pass on to us when one has that dilemma? You know, you've got a church that hasn't been designed with the Orthodox worldview necessarily in
Yeah.
mind, you've got forms of liturgy, and you've got this balance to create, haven't
Well, I think the most important principle is don't don't make a religion or a god out of style.
you? Hmm.
Architectural style is the least important thing at play here. Um, and you started this conversation saying let us not try to impose the qualities of domed architecture on a basilica. I'm very glad you said that. That's a mistake people frequently make. They'll move into a church that has no dome, and then they'll make a big plywood circle and, like, hang it from the rafters and paint Christ Pantocrator there. Um, and that's kind of ridiculous,
Mm-hmm.
especially when you consider that the most famous Orthodox churches in the world are basilicas with no dome.
Mm.
Bethlehem, Sinai, St. Demetrius in Thessaloniki, the Prototon Cathedral on Mount Athos, like all of the highest ranking, oldest churches of the Orthodox world are basilicas with no dome.
Mm.
And that's perfectly fine.
Mm.
Just because the sort of historical terminus of monastic architecture ultimately ended up all domes and plaster doesn't doesn't mean that the rest of the architectural traditions in church building are unsuitable for Orthodox worship. It just means that they're suitable in different ways. The focus has to be in different places.
Yes.
Um, and then secondly, getting more specifically about architectural style, um, it's not important that the building have the correct style, meaning Byzantine. That's not important. What's important is that the building speak with one voice, that whatever style the building has
Yes.
express itself coherently and speak as a whole. And I firmly believe that any style can be used as the foundation of an icon of the kingdom of heaven. I really believe that. Some styles some styles may do that in ways that are more straightforward than others. Um, but even a style that we might consider very alien to Orthodox sensibilities, like Baroque, um, also works to create an icon of the kingdom of heaven. Um, of course, one thinks of Baroque Catholic churches that are all statues and paintings and clouds and saints and everything, and has a certain heavenly splendor of a particular Baroque style. That's an obvious example. But of course, it exists in Orthodoxy as well. There's innumerable churches in Russia and all over the Orthodox East that were built as Orthodox churches in the Baroque style.
Mm.
Um, and some are more successful than others, but the ones that are successful are very beautiful indeed. Um, so we shouldn't come into a Baroque church. I mentioned Baroque here because the basilica that your parish is going to be using is in a sort of Christopher Wren English Baroque style, more or less. Um, that's a good and beautiful style. It has a logic to it, an order to it. It has a lot of cultural meaning in England in particular. Um, and I think you're going to have to figure out how to engage with that style in a way that honors it and supports it, um, whilst also doing what you need to do, which is to make the inside of the church feel like an icon of the kingdom of heaven.
Yes.
Um, we have a rather beautiful example of this working in St. Paul's Cathedral in London. Um, St. Paul's Cathedral, of course, when it was originally built at the end of the 17th century, had no iconography except for the sort of secular iconography of monuments to war heroes and aristocrats and that sort of thing. Um, the, the walls and the ceilings, the plastered surfaces were plain white, and all of the interest was in architectural carving and organ cases and choir stalls and that sort of thing. And then I understand at one point Queen Victoria visited St. Paul's Cathedral for some state occasion and made an offhand remark that the place seemed awfully plain and dull. It didn't have the sort of splendid color that she was used to from Victorian churches. And so, so if Queen Victoria makes a remark like that, all the forces of the British Empire have to be immediately put into play to remedy the problem. And so they added these gorgeous sort of pre-Raphaelite style iconographic mosaics on the ceilings. And they work splendidly with the architecture, even though stylistically they are not of the 17th century. The color scheme they chose, the general richness of all the greens and purples and golds, the general scale of the images, the way they work with the lighting in that space, they're amazingly beautiful, and they don't undermine the architecture at all. In fact, I think St. Paul's wouldn't be half the liturgical space that it is if it didn't have those mosaics. So it is possible to actually improve a historic church, considerably improve it with these types of interventions, and not, without undermining the integrity at all.
I wondered if it's not forward of me, if we could look through pictures of St Julian's to apply some of these principles to a particular place. If we go on screen share, would that be good?
Sure.
Okay, then. So I'll open them up and then I'll go into screen share. What I've got is a number of images here, basically how it is. And then using Photoshop, I and some people in my parish have sort of stripped some things out and added some things in. So I'll just get that on screen share. So this is sort of how it is at the moment. The wooden parts on the left between the columns, these are added actually for a film set. There's a Charles Dickens film made. Likewise with this here, that's like a street scene, all that is still there, but that's going to be removed. It's got nothing to do with the original church. Here, we just basically stripped it back to what it would have been when it was first built, apart from the pews. Here, basically here, I've removed these additions here and just put in the simplest things, basically carpet on the floor. I just cut and pasted this icon screen from one I made in stone for a church in Amsterdam, and we've taken out the this fake building here. And then I thought, I don't know what you think about this idea, but we have about 120 people at the moment who comfortably fill this area. But if we completely removed everything like this, it might look as though we rattled around a bit. And I noticed in Thessaloniki, in some of the ancient churches, basilicas, they had remnants of these low marble walls here so that they were open enough so people could stand on the side and still participate. But they were closed enough so that if you had a small number of people, you didn't feel you're rattling around. And here I marbleized the columns or made them like porphyry, just add a bit of warmth, I think. And then here in the next stage, I thought perhaps do something. I mean, this is just cutting and pasting something in the triumphal arch, drawing on basically Roman basilican ideas. We're not sure at the moment. We've got stained glass here. Here I just put like a mist over it. So I don't know what will be done with the stained glass window if we leave it or whatever. In the final phase, I thought, I don't know, one idea I had for the ceiling was something like that. I'm afraid it's blue, but I haven't included them in here. I thought some sort of simple, with a white background or off-white background, so it's not too heavy, perhaps a standing figure or two between the windows. So what are your thoughts about those ideas?
Sure. Well, if you go back to the picture of how it looks now, there's some things that I like about this. I think it's important that the iconostasis that its architectural structure, the framework around the icons, be designed in a classical mode that looks like it belongs with the church.
Yes.
I don't think this is a situation where it would be appropriate to put in a sort of a medieval Byzantine style of, you know, columns and lintel, just because this building has such an intense classical order expressed in it. It's got these Tuscan order columns and entablature on top, and it's got a classical order to the window behind the altar, and that that's such a strong visual hierarchy. Yeah, you can see it's a sort of a French Ionic order at the window frame there. That's such a strong classical order that I feel like to put in a non-classically ordered iconostasis, like the one you did in Amsterdam, for instance, would really be discordant with this building.
What
Um,
I've designed is a very temporary wooden screen, um, is actually very much like this part here. So you've got
mhm,
two columns with an icon, and then in the middle you've got an arch. So it's actually very much like that. Do you
yeah.
think that would work?
Yes, it might. It might. Yeah, it's interesting. Even that sort of mock storefront isn't terrible, you know, because
Mm.
it's got classical pilasters.
Mhm.
It actually almost looks like an iconostasis that suits the
Yes.
building. You know,
Yeah.
it could be a lot better than that, of course, but even something as straightforward as that, that's properly classically detailed with two very large icons, could suit the building fairly well.
Mm.
Yeah, the biggest hurdle in a building like this is how do you keep the iconostasis from visually competing with the east window?
Yes.
Um, you know, the east window, of course, is currently the focus of the church. It's meant to be the focus of the church.
Mm.
The You definitely don't want the iconostasis to be half the height of the arch,
Mm.
because you know that really you never want an iconostasis to be half the height of the arch it's in, because then that's exacerbating the problem of where the
Mm.
focus is.
Mm.
You can choose to do a very short one tier iconostasis and then let the view above it, let that east window be the main focus,
Mm.
or you could do a very tall iconostasis that maybe completely blocks the east window, and just have it be an absolutely splendid, you know, three-tier wall to wall, floor to ceiling type of, you know, Russian type iconostasis. That could be very successful. That would be an expensive iconostasis to make, but it's something I would seriously consider, because then you would completely erase the problem of where is the emphasis. The iconostasis would be absolutely the emphasis. It would dominate the whole church. The window wouldn't compete with it at all. You wouldn't see the window from the nave.
Mm.
Um, in my experience traveling in Eastern Europe is the non-domed basilica type churches that are most successful tend to be the ones that have an amazing floor to ceiling iconostasis that just absolutely unequivocally is the focus of the space.
Mm.
So
This
it,
is what's called a grade two style listed church, which means permission is needed for interior work. I
mhm.
don't know what they would think about this window. I have seen in some churches where they're not allowed to remove the window, they've just put not a sheet, but let's just say a sheet, so you can see the color coming through, but you're not aware of it being a stained glass window. It's just like a slightly, or whether or not they would let you take it out and then you put iconography there. That'd be interesting. Um,
Tell me, is that, I can see that it's brightly colored glass.
mhm.
I can't really
Yeah, so it's
perceive
very
the
interesting
quality in the
iconographically.
photo.
You've got the transfiguration in the top part here.
Yeah.
You've got obviously the deposition there, the Last Supper there, Christ's baptism, and I'm not sure what that is there. Now the bottom one is interesting. I think it may be the Ascension, but it's a bit strange. But my guess is that is the Ascension, and that's Transfiguration. So
Yes.
iconographically, it's quite
What is the,
unusual for a Western church.
like what is the beauty or quality of that glass? Is that like a really fine treasure, or is it
Uh,
mediocre factory made glass.
um, no, I mean it's Victorian and handmade glass.
Yeah,
You know, it's reasonably good quality.
yeah,
Mainly painted glass. So, I mean, it's yeah, they painted the designs on. It's not like if you yeah, so yeah, it's Victorian
very
glass.
cool.
It could be made by Bell, I think it is, who was the largest
Yeah,
Victorian glass making company. Um,
yeah. I mean, my inclination, at least as the initial moves for occupying this church, would be leave that window as is and leave it visible,
mm,
make the iconostasis short, and then put really brilliant icons in the iconostasis, ones that are intense in their color and expression, so that they are not overwhelmed by the stained glass window.
yeah.
Um, and that
And,
that 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 will at least keep you from accusations of, tearing apart historical stuff in the church.
yes.
Um, maybe in the future, if your church grows, if you're definitely going to be there forever, maybe you'd consider, then going to a much taller iconostasis, or
Yeah.
repurposing that window.
Yeah, I don't think a tall iconostasis would work in our parish. It's a Greek one,
Yeah.
and I think
Yes.
there is a tradition there. I don't think myself it would work that well.
Yeah.
Um, the screen that we're just about to put up on Friday, it's actually just delivered today, is I think I'm not sure if I've got the perspective right. It's not the center isn't like that. It's just a straight arch like you've got
Yeah.
above. So it is one tier, and it's likely we'll have a one tier screen there. One thing I wanted
Yeah.
to ask you is what do you think about, particularly in basilicas, the ciborium above the altar? Because that can give a certain emphasis to the east. Of course, they tended not to be used when you had an icon screen. There was basically a sort of an icon screen without being one, in the sense that it gave a certain focus to the east end.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's a good idea. It's another way of cutting down on the visibility of that window for sure.
Mm.
And you could see it rising up above the iconostasis, which would be some nice layering of space. Yeah, I mean, certainly those ciboriums evolved with the basilica in ancient times, and they're a good spatial match for it.
Mm.
Um,
And what do you think of whichever color one uses, doing something with the columns?
oh
There is a
yeah,
strong tradition in Britain of that. Like just down the road, you've got Ettingham Park,
yes,
and that has such columns, which
yes, that's a good idea for
okay,
sure. Yeah, the
okay,
white the white columns feel awfully secular.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, um,
And what do you think of the idea of sort of probably you actually use oak, but probably lime them, so, because you have lots of oak paneling, so that'd be
yes,
honouring the past. The paneling is from the old pews there, so I'd thought to make this isn't done, but it's rather clumsily done here. But I'd imagine that would be oak but limed, so they're not heavy and dark. What do you think of this idea of having these low partitions on the side?
well, I mean, I like having wood there. If you go back to the existing picture, where it has all those, um,
Yeah.
what are those? Are they confessionals on the sides?
No, this church was bought about 30, 40 years ago by a devout evangelical because the Anglican church was selling it, and I think he wanted it to not fall into Muslim hands or whatever. And then he had it as a craft centre. So in fact, all these here are repurposed pews, so they're real oak, lovely, beautifully made. And then people had their stalls here. So the front here would be open, and the craftspeople would work behind, and then sell
Interesting.
stuff through. Um, so my thought was to the top part here is actually that looks carved, is actually just cast plaster.
Hmm.
This was probably done in the film set. So my thought was to perhaps retain all these now are rooms of storage basically, but is to retain in one form or the other the cubicles on the west end, but then open up the front three bays, but
Yeah.
have and then move the heaters back to the wall or have some other form of heating so they wouldn't be there. These are convection heaters, I think. But use the oak here, either dark or red
Yeah.
laser.
Yeah. Well, I guess my only thought is, I mean, it looks really nice having wood there.
Mm,
That's of course very typical of, like of the Christopher Wren City of London churches, to have the white plaster contrast with dark wood, sort of high wainscoting and choir stalls and so forth all around the church.
mm,
Um, I mean, obviously functionally, these are not any use to you, but visually, I like the presence of wood in those locations. So
mm.
what comes to mind is, what if you put in between those columns sort of high-backed stasivia? Um,
Yeah. Yep.
this would make the
Somewhat
space
different.
this would
Mm,
make the space very much like the like St George's Cathedral at the Fenor,
mhm,
um,
mhm,
where it's a basilica. Actually, it's a basilica rather a lot like this actually, and there's high backed dark
mm.
wood stasivia,
Okay.
that separates the central nave from the side aisles. So that might be more functional and familiar than just
Mm,
sort of low knee walls like this, because it would actually give you a place to sit,
good.
and it would be a high enough barrier that you could actually turn the side spaces into maybe little side chapels or some other function.
My only concern is if you have a lot of people standing the aisle would feel completely cut off from what's happening in the nave, which is my idea of having just something about 3 feet high or a bit lower, so that if you have
Well,
overflow.
again, is if your goal is to make the church kind of contract a bit so that it's a more appropriate scale for a smaller congregation,
Mm,
something tall might something tall would probably work better, because if you picture 100 people standing in there, you won't even see those 3 foot high walls.
I
They
certainly,
kind of
yeah.
they'll become visually meaningless if people block their view. Um,
Yes, I see what you mean. Okay. In terms of the material for the icon screen, do you think stone or wood?
um, well, that gray stone, um, on the column plinths. I
Yeah.
mean, one could picture it being built out of that. Um, but it also would be very sensible to use oak, give it an ammonia fumed finish, to match the old pews, um, and kind of detail it, sort of detail it almost like a Christopher Wren,
Mhm.
rood screen or iridos, just fairly slender and light with a little bit of classical detailing it, and then some, large and beautiful icons set in that
Yeah.
would that would suit the architecture quite well.
The icon screen I did for our still existing, we still use it during week services. It is made out of aged oak, different design from the one we'd have here, but I'll bring that up because that's I suppose got a similar atmosphere, I think, to what you're talking of. Again, this was recycled wood, so it was acknowledging what was there before. Um, so that sort of oak, larger icons, not probably with two tiers,
Yeah.
but that sort of thing you had in mind, but more sort of Christopher Wren detailing.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
good.
I think having a real classical order in the
Yeah,
woodwork is
because yeah,
important for it to tie
yeah,
into the building.
yeah.
Yeah,
So the type of capitals one would be the main thing, wouldn't it? And any molding relating to which you've got there already.
yeah, yeah.
Perhaps taking a clue from the east wall.
Yes, so there's already a classical hierarchy there where they've gone
Mm,
from a Tuscan nave to an Ionic,
mhm,
chancel.
mm,
Um, so you could choose in a different order for the iconostasis.
yeah.
In terms of the color of the wood, yeah, if you were starting with a blank slate in terms of woodwork, I too would probably go with a golden medium toned oak like your Shrewsbury iconostasis. However, um, if you've already got historic woodwork in the church that's going to retain and it's all dark oak, you might want to just stick with the dark oak.
Mm.
Um, Like that organ case, is that going to stay, or are you removing
No,
that?
it's actually there's no organ there, so that would go. We may, if we remove the top part, we may retain the bottom part as a sort of a
Yeah.
place for, a vestry effectively. But that upper part will probably disappear. I mean, all this depends on what permission we're allowed.
Yes.
But that'd be the idea.
Yeah.
I took clues from some of your churches. There is actually a big red carpet down the middle, but these are, I think, it's cut and paste from one of your own churches having carpets there. I think that softens things and makes it a bit more intimate because it can
Yeah.
seem rather large, open space otherwise. What I'm not sure about, I think certainly doing something in the triumphal arch, but whether or not we get permission as far as the east wall goes to do anything with this, because basically these are just stucco cherubs really, and not particularly
Hmm.
attractive. I don't know if they're original or not, but it'd be nice to be able to do something there. I thought perhaps Pentecost,
Yes.
because that shape there
Yeah, that
lends
makes
itself to.
sense.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah, you'll have an interesting project just kind of settling on a color scheme
mm,
for all this iconography and for the ceiling.
mm,
Um, I would yeah, I think you already realize that the dark blue ceiling is probably not the best choice.
no,
Probably inverting that to being like a gold ceiling with blue stars
yeah,
would be more suitable
yeah,
based on how the lighting works. Because again, when you this church has neither a dome nor a clear story, so the central ceiling is poorly lit.
mm,
Um, so but if you made that ceiling actually gilded, then it would reflect back the light from the chandeliers and it would look quite bright and splendid.
mm,
Even if it just had some gilded details in it, it would look quite splendid.
mm, interesting. And what do you think of the idea of to keep things simple, having an off-white background, but having, I thought, sort of standing saints that doesn't look, you could, from this angle, doesn't look like they can fit it, but quite comfortably, you could have two standing saints
Oh, for
there.
sure.
And I thought roundels along the top.
Yes.
So just sort of not big cramp, but one or two roundels for each window with a bust or just a head in. Um, if one were to have anything down below, I thought again, perhaps standing saints, but won't necessarily be necessary, or perhaps feasts along the top so that they're low enough to read. Um, one possibility is feasts along the upper part of upper third, and then the lower third. That's probably about, what's that now? About 15 feet from there down. So you could have standing or busts, perhaps busts along the bottom part. But I don't want to clutter it, but I thought having saints on the side would really give that sense of the communion of the saints.
Yeah. Well, now, one important thing to consider is if you paint iconography on all of the walls and ceilings, I think you're going to need to figure out how that ties into the plaster entablature and
Mm,
column capitals.
yes.
I think if you were to leave them white, that might work if the iconography is very classical Roman looking.
Mhm,
You know, one direction you could take with this church is to say because it's a classical style building, let's paint it as if this were the fourth century and paint it in a kind of an imperial Roman style of
mm,
iconography.
mm.
That's what that's what Father Zenon
Bring
in
them on,
Russia
yes.
would do, for instance, where the backgrounds are white, the figures are very heroic, classical, um, and then you kind of retain the very white, austere imperial Roman ethos of this building. That would be one direction, which I suspect you're not going to do because that's not really your style. The
No,
the
I wouldn't put words in my mouth. In fact, that's what I had in mind, really. That sort of Roman style and
yes,
having a white background. And I suppose I didn't want to put figurative iconography in the ceiling. But,
yeah,
I mean, I hadn't given a lot of thought to this, but I had to do something quickly just to show the potential of the church for those who thought it's going to be a bad move. So I had to show that, it
yes.
could be enriched in some way. So I
Yes.
didn't give
Well,
a
I
lot
guess
of thought to
what
the
I was
ceiling.
getting at though is just that if you get a lot of color into the iconography,
Mm.
you may need to put some color into the architectural moldings. You know,
Right. Yeah.
pick out some details on that entablature and put in color and gilding
Yes.
because you don't want the architecture to look plain compared to the iconography.
Yeah.
Um,
Since
that
that's what
would
they've done here, they've put gold, well, fake gold
yeah,
there, and they've added a bit of color
yeah.
with molding and picked it out a bit more.
Yeah,
I've done it more here, in fact. That
there's a
is
little bit
gilding there.
there.
And yeah,
Yeah, it's a little dowdy and gray, you know. It could
yeah,
be a lot more rich and
yeah,
splendid than that. But
yeah.
yeah, you know,
Mm.
it's a lot of work enriching the whole interior in parallel. It's
Yeah, yeah.
it's a daunting project for sure.
Oh, it excites me. I mean,
Yes.
people tend to judge time to do things on the basis of how long it takes a portable icon to paint a panel icon. But I find wall paintings, I do them quickly. You know, you're going for the overall scheme. You're not getting down to every freckle in here. So I've done the east wall of my church. I painted in 10 days at
Mm,
Shrewsbury, and that's got a massive Pantocrator and angels and the
yes,
four living creatures. So I don't think it's that daunting myself. But anyway,
that's wonderful.
before we finish off acoustics, could you say one or two words about acoustics? Because this is a big issue. We don't use microphones at all. The acoustics are quite good, and the choir is very audible. The priest doesn't need a microphone. Um, but is there anything you would suggest as to do or not to do to retain acoustics or improve them?
Um, well, when you have an existing structure like this, probably you can't do anything to increase the reverberation. Um, you can do things to decrease it in terms of, you know, putting down carpeting. Um, how this church is fairly large. How, I mean, do you think the reverberation is where you want it, or is it too much?
Um, I think it's about right, really. You can hear a
Yeah,
sermon easily. No, I think the resonance is good. It's just about right.
yeah. Well, that's very lucky to have a church with good
Yeah, we are.
acoustics. I mean,
Yeah.
obviously, you know, soft surfaces like carpets
Mm,
will deaden that a little bit, but of course having people in the space will deaden it also. So
mm,
if there's a lot of people in there, then the carpets might not actually make much difference because there's going to be people
mm,
on top of those carpets either way. Um, yeah, I mean, this church has it has what you need to have good acoustics, which is that it has hard surfaces, it has architectural complexity, so
mm.
that'll break up, you know, resonances and flutter echoes. It'll give you a smooth decay. Um, and most importantly, it's got height, so there's
Mm,
plenty of room for the sound to bounce around above people's heads, and
yes,
that's, you know, that means the building will stay reverberant even if there's a lot of people in it, and
yes.
that's the most important quality for a church.
Mm. That's
Yeah,
wonderful, Andrew.
it's
I've
a very good
taken a lot of
building.
your time, and it's been really. I think we're both practical people, and they were also philosophers in a sense. You've got to be, don't you, to design good churches, etc. But we do like to express things. So it's been quite handy to talk about your principles in the light of an actual building. Um,
Yeah, when was
Unfortunately, it's not more difficult to build new things in this country than it is in America. Uh,
yeah.
Purpose-built churches are quite rare in this country. Orthodox churches are quite rare in this country. So often we've got to make do with what Providence gives to us.
Well, it's that's a blessing in its way though, because you
Mm,
know you're able to acquire historic churches that
yeah.
would cost untold millions to build nowadays.
Mm,
And you have so many historic churches, whereas here in America, it's not easy to find a beautiful historic church that's for sale
yeah.
in an area where anyone wants to go to church. So we almost always have to build new if we want a good building.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's been wonderful to talk, Andrew, and I know lots of people find this very, very, very helpful. And so it'll be on my Patreon site, and then we'll release it in full to YouTube. But we'll also put it straight up into YouTube, you know, about a 5-minute version of it. The things you've said that seem to summarize what you've said in a fuller way. So it's been a real joy as always, Andrew, and God willing, I'll get to you or you get to me sometime. You're always very
All
welcome.
right.
Yeah, good.
That sounds wonderful. Well, thanks
All
for
right
talking.
then. Love you all. God bless. Bye-bye.
Bye.